people that were here earlier, but today we have a lot to cover because now that we are out of the womb and into the real world, there is just so much going on. So today we're going to be talking about birth, infancy, and toddlerhood, very early sort of toddlerhood, very much the stages of birth to age 2. All right, so my first question for you guys is, why do you think that we focus so much on early development? Why do you think we look into that so much compared to maybe other stages, like when we're older? What makes this stage like super duper important? What do you think?
Personally, I think it's because like that's where like everything starts, and like maybe like it's like maybe more important than like what happens after, because as Lily said, it shapes the rest of our lives. It's just like if like you don't have a good foundation, it won't like be better like in the future or somehow.
Yeah, that was a perfect response. Honestly, that's probably better than how I could phrase it. So you are correct that one of the reasons why scientists and developmental psychologists focus so much on early development is because it sets the foundation. We do so much growing in the first 2 years of our lives that stuff that happens there can change the way that our brains work, and just so many things can happen in just those first 2 years. So here's a quote from a textbook that I really like using for taking notes and stuff like that. You'll probably see some tables and diagrams and pictures from that same textbook. So the quote right here is, let me just move some stuff so I can actually see it. That's what I want to do. So researchers have given this part of the lifespan more attention than any other period, perhaps because changes during this time are so dramatic and so noticeable. So we already talked about the foundation part. The book that I'm looking at goes on to talk about that too. But this part is basically saying that if you think about it, if you think about a newborn compared to a 2-year-old, there's a huge difference in all sorts of things. You know, newborns, they kind of just lay there, they cry, they go through like, they sleep a bunch. And then you think about 2-year-olds and they're like running around, they're active. We call them the terrible twos. If you guys have heard that term before, they're kind of wild children. So if you think about like how much change has to happen to go from a newborn to a 2-year-old, it's a lot. And we're going to go into that today. That's what we're going to be talking about today. There's just so much that we do as in this stage of life that it makes sense to focus a lot more on it. Okay, so today's agenda, we have 4 main questions that we're going to look at. The first is, how do we assess newborns at birth? What are some common infant reflexes? How do babies perceive the world? And how do babies develop physically, cognitively, and socially? If you remember those terms from week 1, physically refers to our development with our bodies and how we grow. Cognitively refers to our brains and how we develop mentally. And then socially is how we develop in our relationships with other people. So we're going to talk about all of these things today. As I've said multiple times now, today is going to be a very packed day because again, this time period is packed with development. So there's just so much for us to talk about. And I'm not even covering like half of it, which is crazy. All right, so starting off with birth. So we left off right at the end of prenatal development. So once the womb gets too tight, it's time for us to come out. So after birth, which I'll skip the details of, newborns are assessed with the APGAR test. And you do that test 1 minute and then 5 minutes right after birth. And I have a picture of it right here. So basically we have 5 different measures and then a scale from 0 to 2. So the first one is appearance. So we So the best case scenario is that we don't have any blue discoloration, and the worst case scenario is that we're blue all over. Now, the reason why blue is bad in this case is it implies that the baby isn't getting the oxygen that it needs. So getting a high score on that would mean that you are getting all the oxygen that you need and your lungs are working as they should. Next one is pulse. Obviously, having a heartbeat is very important. So a heartbeat that is greater than 100 beats per minute is the best case scenario. You want to have that should be pumping really, really fast, getting all of that oxygen and all those nutrients throughout your body. And then the worst case scenario is, of course, no pulse at all. I'm sure you can already understand why that's a big problem. The next one, the G in APGAR stands for grimace. So when a baby is stimulated or touched or poked and stuff like that, the best case scenario is that a baby will cry and respond to that in a negative way. And then the worst case is that they don't have any response at all. They're not even conscious of what's going on. The second A is activity. The best case scenario there would be that the baby can move its muscles and resist movement like in the muscles. So if maybe like the nurse is there, if the baby's like squishing his hands in like this, they will resist a push from a nurse to try and extend their arm back out. And then the worst case scenario is no movement at all, which would just mean that their muscles are kind of floppy and they're just kind of laying there, which is obviously bad. And then the last one, the R, stands for respiration. So this is breathing. So obviously having a really strong, loud cry is good because that means that the baby is clearly breathing. And if the baby isn't crying or isn't doing anything, that implies that the baby isn't breathing and isn't getting the oxygen that it needs. So that's APGAR. You might hear that if you ever watch any, medical drama stuff. They might talk about the APGAR test. And then another test that they use is the neonatal behavioral assessment scale. That one is often used for babies that have a lower APGAR score, and it can also be used to just look at different newborn experiences across different cultures and different countries. And then the next test that we do is about 24 to 48 hours after. It's called a heel stick. Basically, we take just a few drops of blood from a baby's foot, and then we analyze it to check for any genetic defects, congenital defects, or birth defects. And then we also screen the baby for hearing problems like deafness and some major heart problems, because if babies are born with heart defects, they're often brought straight into surgery. And then some of the problems that we see in babies, the first one is anoxia, which is pretty much a word to use when the baby's brain isn't getting the oxygen that it needs. This is obviously very, very serious because when you're cut off from oxygen for too long, that can result in a lot of brain damage or even death. The next one would be low birth weight. So obviously, if a baby isn't at the weight that it should be at birth, that's a problem because the baby isn't getting the nutrients it needs. It's not going to be able to stay warm in the colder environment outside of their mom. So low birth weight is also really a problem. And then next would be preterm or post-mature, which are two opposites. Preterm would be our word for a premature baby that is born before 37 weeks. Obviously, these babies haven't developed fully yet, so they need to be monitored a lot. You can often see them in the little incubators. They're often really, really tiny. And they have to develop outside of the womb, which is not ideal. And then post-mature refers to when a baby just doesn't leave the womb and we're way past the due date and they're just not coming out. And that often leads to doctors having to induce labor. And then another problem would be small for date. That's basically just a word to use to talk about a baby that isn't at the weight and the height and the development that it should be at that point in time. So maybe a baby at 32 weeks looks like a baby at 15 weeks, which is really, really bad, of course, because that baby isn't developing at the pace it should. So there must be some sort of issue going on. So that's another issue that we can see. All right, so characteristics of newborns. We're going to talk about this a lot in the next couple of slides. So the first one is their body proportions are very different. 25% of a newborn's height is made up of their head. Like 1/4 of their entire body is just their head. And if you can imagine what that might be like if we kept that proportion up till adulthood, that would be crazy. So, because right now our heads don't make up the majority of our body, but for babies, for newborns, they've got these big bobbly heads that take up like 1/4 of the space they need. The next one would be brain development. So, although we're born with most of our neurons that we have, our nerve cells, the connections between those cells haven't actually happened yet. And those connections are what are really important for learning and memory and all of the things that we need. So, in the first couple weeks or months, and I guess years of life, babies go through a rapid amount of brain development. And we call this synaptic blooming because these connections just flow outward like flowers. Like you start with one and then it like connects to others, and then you see like this huge like tree almost come up of neurons and networks. So that's another big thing. And you can look at this MRI right here of babies' brains. If you look at the 1 week brain, it's tiny, there's not a lot happening. And then you look at 1 year and there's just a huge change. And it's a lot more significant than the jump from 1 year to 2 year or even 1 year to 10 years. There's a huge difference from here to here. And then the other thing that we can talk about is sleep. So babies sleep a lot. They sleep around 16.5 hours a day, which means they're only awake for like 6 hours or so, 6.5 to 7 hours, which is not much at all. So babies need lots of sleep. Sleep is when babies do a lot of their brain development, and then they can kind of take in all of the new stuff that's around them and process all of it. That's part of the reason why we sleep even now. It's a way for us to process information, and babies have to process a lot of new information. So it makes sense that they sleep a bunch. So next, let's talk about some of the reflexes that newborns have at birth. Now, this is really big because these reflexes are vital for survival. This is making you dizzy. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happens in these first 2 years of life. It definitely was a lot for me just making these slides and just looking through how much I needed to put in here. It's crazy how much there is going on. So these are just some of the reflexes that babies have when they're born. These are really important as if you think about like back in caveman times, we needed a lot of these reflexes in order to survive in a harsher world. So the first one is the sucking reflex. Babies will essentially start sucking on anything that gets close to their mouth. So this is important, of course, because babies need to get milk and nutrients they need from milk. So bottles and stuff, they know instinctively to start sucking on a baby bottle. Rooting. Oh, I see, Angelina, you raised your hand. You need to.
Can you put the slides in the chat?
Yes, I will. I'll actually just do that right now so I don't forget later. Give me 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then copy paste the link for you guys. Okay, let me put this in the chat. All right, there's the link to slides. You guys can follow along on there if you want. And if you want to go back to other slides too, that's okay. All right, so back to what we were doing. Okay, so the next reflex is the rooting reflex. So basically, whenever a baby's cheek is touched, they'll instinctively turn to the side. So usually that would just mean that they would respond to something that touches their cheek, and they can move towards it and get a closer look at what it is. The grasping reflex is, if you can think about like monkeys, how they're able to like hold on super duper tightly to their mom's backs. We think that this might be a remnant from something like that, since we're also primates. So an infant's fingers will essentially, if you decide to take your finger and then put it right in the middle in their palm, they'll immediately grasp onto it like this. So you can just like push down a little bit and then their hands will immediately close up and grab onto you really, really tightly too. I have a little sister, so I actually saw this myself with my little sister. All of these reflexes are real, they exist, they're a thing, which is pretty crazy. Then the next one that we have is the Babinski reflex, which is a really fun name. So I actually don't know why this one is a thing, but whenever you stroke a baby's foot, you're gonna see their toes kind of stretch out like that. That's another reflex that they have. The other one is a Moro reflex. So the Moro reflex, it's kind of like baby bracing. So a sudden noise or maybe a sudden like loss of support, like if the baby is fallen or something, they're gonna like splay their arms out and then like pull them back in to kind of protect themselves and brace themselves in an emergency where they might have to move really quickly or they might be dealing with sudden movements. So that's one thing. The next one is the tonic neck reflex. This is another one where I'm not really sure why we have this reflex. So when babies are on their back and their head is to one side, one of their arms is going to go this way, and then one of their arms is going to go that way. And then basically that picture right here describes it better than I could with words. They're going to kind of look like a fencer, I guess, is how this book described it. Again, I'm not entirely sure why we have this one. If you have any theories for why we might have that reflex, feel free to share them. I'd love to hear them. You guys want to ponder that too for the next part of class, you can do that as well. And then the stepping reflex is when baby's legs touch a smooth surface, they're going to start moving like they're walking, which could be a precursor to actually being able to walk. Knowing how those muscles will move and that coordination, that's probably why we have that reflex. Okay, so there's two big things that I want to talk about that are very dangerous for infants. I'm going to go over them pretty briefly. So the first one is shaken baby syndrome. It's caused when you vigorously shake a baby, which is not good for a lot of reasons. It's a severe form of abuse. You can get put in prison and you can lose custody of your child if you get caught for this. The reason why it's so bad is because, as we've mentioned, small children have really big heads and really weak neck muscles. So when you shake them, their heads will flop around a bunch, and that can cause bleeding in the brain or the eyes. And of course, bleeding in your brain is a huge, huge problem. And it can result in cognitive defects, severe dysfunction, and it oftentimes results in coma or death. The other danger is sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. This is the leading cause of death in infants, and it's basically just an unexplained infant death. It's often because the baby isn't getting enough oxygen or isn't breathing the way they should, and it's why we are so restrictive of how babies sleep. In cribs, babies don't get to sleep on their stomachs. They have to sleep on like harder bed like mattresses, and because softer ones would like fall into them and get kind of squished. We use really thin sheets. We don't have like toys and stuff in the crib when they're sleeping, and why smoking around babies is really bad because it can also affect how much oxygen they get. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the big physical milestones that babies go through. So the first ones we'll talk about are gross milestones. So these would be big movements of your head, your arms, your legs, your torso, which is like your chest part. So these are our milestones that we have. So this would be things like walking and like big movements. So at 2 months, that would be when they can start holding up their head, when you can like roll over, and when they can kind of do that little cobra pose when they push up on their tummy. And then the arm and leg movements become a lot smoother. They aren't kind of just like flailing around. At 4 months, that's when babies can start kind of holding their head unsupported. This is when they might be able to start rolling over. They can bring their hands to their mouth. And when they're lying on their stomach, they can push up all the way to their elbows. At 6 months, that's when you can start rolling in both directions. So from their back onto their tummy, and then from their tummy back onto their back. This is also when some babies start to sit without support, and they might even start standing and support weight on their legs. You might see little babies like bouncing up and down. They could rock back and forth. They could crawl backwards. I know at some point here you can start seeing that little army crawl where they like use their arms and legs to push themselves forward. 9 months is when they can stand with some support. They can get into a sitting position and then start sitting without any support. And then they can pull themselves up to stand and start crawling. And then at 1 year, that is about when we start seeing the first parts of walking. So they can pull up, stand, they can walk with support by holding on to furniture. That's called cruising. They might be able to take a few steps without holding on, and they might be able to stand without moving. 18 months, which is a year and a half, was when you can start walking alone. They might be able to go up steps and run. They can hold toys with them while they walk. You can see them like dragging on like little telephones and things like that, or like little toys. And then they might be able to start helping to undress themselves. And then 2 years is when we start seeing a lot of stuff happening. You can stand on your tiptoes, kicking a ball. You can start climbing and throwing, big stuff like that. And then the next thing are fine motor milestones. So these would be precise movements of your hands and fingers, your feet and toes. So the big things that we can talk about here are at 4 months, we call something called the palmar grasp, which is when you can hold a toy, like grasp it with your whole hand. And then at 9 months, that's when we start seeing something called the pincer grip, which is when you can use your thumb and your index finger to hold on to things. So you can often see that 9 months is also when you might start seeing babies eating like solid food. So you can see babies will start to pick up like little snacks with 2 fingers instead of grabbing like handfuls of it. 1 year is when you start seeing like the kitchen music stuff, when they start banging on objects. They can start pointing at things at age 1. And then 18 months is when you can start, holding like a pencil and like scribbling and eating with a spoon, drinking from a cup, and stacking objects. And then age 2 is when we see a big amount of change. So we start seeing like handedness at age 2. They might use their left hand more than their right hand, or vice versa. They can often learn to use buttons and zippers, and they are often a lot better at drinking and feeding themselves. Okay, so now let's talk about sensory capabilities. So the 3 big senses that we're going to focus on are vision, hearing, and then smell and taste. They're kind of connected, so I'm going to pile them into one. So vision is the most poorly developed at birth, which makes sense because it's not like you can see very much before you're born. There's not that much to look at. Babies can actually only see about 8 to 16 inches away at birth, which is very convenient because when a mother is holding their baby, the length from the baby's face and their eyes to the mom's face, that's about that length of 8 to 16 inches. So that's probably why we have that already with us at birth, so that we can see whoever's holding us. And because babies have such horrible vision, that's why we tend to use bright colors and patterns in baby toys, so that they can actually like recognize the differences between them. But it's important to note that our senses improve super duper fast to make up for all that we weren't able to develop in the prenatal stage. So usually by even just like a couple months or almost a year, babies can see almost at the same level as an adult, which is pretty crazy because babies have what we call 2400 vision. Usually when you think about it as 20/20, that basically just means that you can, whatever something looks at, like at 20 feet away for, okay, I did not explain that right. So if you think about for us, what something looks like at 400 feet away from us, like super blurry and out there, that's the visual accuracy that babies have when they look at something that's only 20 feet away. So they have horrific vision, like it's bad. Okay, so next is hearing. So hearing is actually a super duper strong sense at birth. So babies can often already recognize the voices of their parents, and they actually prefer the voices of their moms over other females, and they actually prefer female voices compared to male voices. They also often prefer infant directed speech. We know that as baby talk. So, you know how when our voices go all high pitched and we use like weird little words like horsey and wow, and we like kind of change how we speak when we're with babies. Babies actually prefer when we talk like that. But it is recommended that we don't use a lot of baby talk since that can hinder a baby's language development if they don't get like solid language. Um, Another cool thing is that they will innately respond to the sounds of any language. So, regardless of what language their parents are in, for the first couple months, they'll understand and make sounds from every single language, not just the one they're born in. And then eventually, through like repetition and how our brains will develop, that'll fade over time, and you'll only really be able to recognize sounds from your own language. And then smell and taste. We might actually be born with our preferences for smells and tastes. So you can see down here in this picture.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So like if like you talk Spanish for like when your baby born, they'll understand Spanish.
So they won't understand Spanish. If you think about different languages have different sounds to them. Like I know like Chinese is a really good example. A lot of experiments are done looking at English versus Chinese because Chinese has very different sounds and very different, it just sounds really different compared to English. And the cool thing about little tiny newborns is that they can identify sounds that are unique to English and sounds that are unique to Chinese, for example. But then
okay.
after a certain point, they stop recognizing those differences based on what language they're more exposed to. So they won't be able to understand a language immediately, but they'll be able to recognize aspects of that language, I guess.
The annoying.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good question. So, all right, so smell and taste, what was I talking about? So you might actually be born with your preferences for smell and taste. In this picture down here, this is a little newborn that's been given some things to taste, and you can see how there's different reactions compared to whether they were given a sweet thing or a sour thing or a bitter thing. And babies love sweet things.
Obviously.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's move on to cognitive development, which is our brain development. So week 1, we talked about Piaget and his theory for cognitive development. Birth to age 2 is what we call the sensory motor stage, according to Piaget. So they're going to focus a lot on using their 5 senses and using movement to understand the world. So a big thing in this stage is called object permanence. So that's the idea of knowing that an object is there even if you can't see it. And babies are really, really bad at object permanence. And that's why peekaboo works. So when you hide your face behind your hands, a baby will think that your face has actually disappeared. So that's why they get so surprised when you go peekaboo and then you show your face again, because it's like it disappeared and then, oh my gosh, it's back. And that leads into what we call
So I did peekaboo on like people on like my little sister. She's already in like 2nd grade, and sometimes she still smiles whenever I do it peekaboo.
Yeah, well, sometimes object permanence can be a little bit of a challenge. I believe there's a YouTube video like making fun of kids who may not have like making fun of like teenagers who are pretending to not have object permanence. It's an interesting idea, and it isn't perfect by the end of the stage either. Even like young toddlers can have issues with object permanence, and it seems that might even move on to further. And then the A not B error is related to object permanence. It's basically when, let's say that you hide, like you have like chair A and chair B. If you hide a toy behind chair A and then the baby knows, and then you show the baby this thing is behind chair A. Even if you show them that you're hiding the ball behind chair B, they'll still go back and look at chair A because they have no idea where the ball went. That's also part of object permanence, where they're not able to understand where something goes when you can't see it. And after this stage, we'll start seeing that object permanence develop. Piaget also split the sensory motor stage into a bunch of substages. So we have simple reflexes. These are all like really long and confusing. The next slide is going to have a better like example-based explanation of all of these. So we have primary reactions, secondary reactions, and then we coordinate these reactions, and then we add on a third layer of reactions, and then we move on to this long thing, which is basically just the idea of our imagination and object permanence, I suppose, is the best word. That's when that starts to develop, right at the very end. So this slide, lots of words, it just explains everything. So substage 1 is just all about reflexes. Like a baby is like reliant on reflexes. That's how they respond to everything. And then the next one is shifting from reflexes to kind of responding to their surroundings in ways that they might actually look at. So this is when if they see something that's interesting, they might make a noise. They might do something like that. Usually that'll be like referring towards the body. So you might see like really little babies just like looking at their hands and making noise because they have no idea what their hands look like. The next stage would be a little bit more looking at the outside world. They might be able to start like doing repeated motions. So they start like doing things multiple times when they enjoy them. And they really enjoy like being able to change their surroundings actively. The next one would be when we start seeing babies have like plans and goals. Like if they're like the example right here is if a toy has maybe gone under the couch, even though that's when object permanence begins to show up. Even though they can't see it, they know that it's down there and they're going to keep trying to find it. The next stage would be their more experimentation, more trying new things. That's when babies do this thing where like they'll like throw something and then they'll have you pick it up and then they'll just throw it back down there again. And that's like what they do because they're experimenting. They want to see if the same thing happens every single time. I have a funny story of when I was a baby when I threw like, so I guess back in the day, the little car like stereos used to come in boxes and you could take them out of your car. So we were on the highway and my dad had opened the window for some reason. And I was playing that game with the little radio box and I threw it out the window when we were driving up the highway. Yeah. So so that's my story of substage 5. And then substage 6 is when we have some real thought on it. So we start thinking and we start using all that experimentation from before to come to conclusions. And we predict what could happen. And we start making like cool things start happening. Lily, I love those emojis. Okay, so this is just this little one that looks at cognitive milestones again in a different way rather than just Piaget. I'm going to skip over this slide because it doesn't really say anything that we don't already know. Okay, language development. Language development is super duper cool. This is probably one of my favorite things to look at when it comes to infant development is how we learn language. So the first stage is called the intentional vocalization. So this is just things like cooing, repeating things that are said by a caregiver or taking turns to repeat things. So you might see if you're talking to a really little baby, you might say something to them and then they'll say something back. And then you say something to them and then they say something back. So it's kind of like conversation practice, except no one really understands anything that's happening. The next stage would be babbling and gesturing. So this is when babies start making those sounds that are related with any language. So they're going to just make noises that are universal, like multiple sounds that might not even be related to the language that they are exposed to. And then as time goes on, they'll start repeating those familiar sounds. And then in this stage, you can also start using gestures to communicate. So for example, for babies that are deaf, that don't have any exposure to language, you'll start seeing them use gestures to communicate. That's also a big reason why a lot of parents start using sign language with their babies. So that's something cool. And then the next stage is understanding. So this is when babies kind of start understanding what's happening around them rather than just hearing random sounds. So you can kind of think of this as when you're learning a new language, oftentimes you can understand what's going on before you can actually communicate in that language. So for me, when I was learning Spanish, it was a lot easier for me to understand Spanish than it was for me to actually speak in Spanish. And babies go through that same process. Stage 4 is called holophrastic speech, which are our first words, I suppose. So that when, I think an example would be like, if a baby wants to talk about juice, they might not say juice, they might just say ju. And they might just use parts of words, but those words have meanings, and you can start connecting those meanings to what they're trying to say. Under extension is the next stage, and that's when you start using one word to talk about multiple objects or multiple words to talk about one object. So we start categorizing what we see and categorizing things into different boxes and schemas, if you remember that word from earlier. And then stage 6, we call it our first words and cultural influences. So something really cool is that our first words can actually be dependent on our native language. And the study that I was looking at was looking at English and Chinese. I'll say it now, English and Chinese are two very common languages to look at language studies. So I believe what it was is that English has a lot of nouns in it. So typically a native English speaking baby's first word will be a noun. And compare that to a Chinese speaking baby. So I think it mentioned that Chinese has a lot of verbs and action words in it. So a lot of times for a Chinese speaking child, their first word will be a verb, which is really cool. So you can kind of think about what your first word is and how that might have connected to what language you were exposed to at home. And then stages 7 and 8 are I kind of combine them together. So vocabulary growth spurt and what we call telegraphic speech. Nowadays, I think a better word for it is text messaging speech. So you can kind of think of it as when we text, we don't always use like perfect grammar and stuff like that. We just kind of put in the words that you really need to understand the message. And babies are going to do the same thing. So they're just going to use like words that they need in order to get their point across. They're not going to worry about proper grammar and proper sentence structure and stuff. And the vocabulary growth spurt is just when babies start really rapidly growing in vocabulary, when they start learning all sorts of new words and using new words. All right, so last thing we're going to talk about is social and emotional development. So the first thing we're going to talk about is temperament. So a baby's temperament is their innate characteristics, like their mood, activity level, and their emotional reactivity. And we can sometimes identify this pretty soon after birth. So we looked at a lot of studies, and there's all sorts of things that we evaluated, different measures, and we kind of split up our temperament into 3 different types. So the first type is easy. So an easy baby is very adaptable to a new routine. They stay calm. They're very easy to calm down in a stressful situation, and they're usually in a positive mood. This is the majority of babies typically. A difficult temperament would be the opposite of an easy development. They usually cry a lot. They might react really negatively to a new situation. They might not be the best at adapting to a new situation. That's about 10% of babies. And then slow to warm up is just kind of like the baby that just doesn't really do much. They're not very active. They don't do a lot. They adjust pretty slowly to a new situation, and they tend to be kind of grumpy. That's about 15%. You'll notice that these percents don't add up to 100, and that's because temperament is not very easy to kind of split into specific groups. So we have a lot of babies that don't really fall into one in particular. And then goodness of fit is what we refer to as when a caregiver is adapting their style for the infant, and that just allows for really good communication between the caregiver and the child. So obviously, parenting, the way that you parent will affect the kid's development, but the kid's temperament and the way the kid is should also be affecting how you parent, since you'll want to adapt to make sure your kid gets the needs that their needs met based on their temperament. Now, something to keep in mind is that temperament is not the same as personality. So personality is a pattern of feeling or thinking or behaving, and it's a mix of your temperament and then like the environment around you. So things like the culture that you grew up in, gender roles will play a big role in your personality, your values and your goals, the way you cope, and then the experiences that you have with your caregivers or with your friends or siblings or all sorts of other people that you're around. Okay, so more on emotional development. So at birth, we don't really have a lot of emotions. Our big emotions are attraction and withdrawal, where we either want something or we don't want something. That's all we've got at birth. There's not really a lot of complexity there. And then another big milestone is called social smiling. So a lot of times you'll see young infants do things that look like smiling when they're just kind of copying what they see their parents do. And eventually they'll start understanding that smiling is a thing that we do when we're happy. So they'll start smiling in order to get a positive response. And smiling will eventually lead to pleasure versus displeasure, showing that you like something versus not liking something. And then eventually anger and fear will start to develop through separation anxiety, that sort of panic that babies feel when they're taken away from a caregiver. These emotions are often categorized into your basic emotions that come first, and then your self-conscious emotions like guilt or fear or stuff like that. That will start coming in later. And then the next thing that we have is called social referencing. That's just when we look at other people for social cues. So if you see mom smiling, then maybe you'll also smile. Or if you see another person, like a sibling, is really sad and frowny, then you'll also be sad and frowny. So you're comparing your responses to other people. And then the final stage of this is emotional self-regulation, which is when we learn to kind of control our emotions in order to get what we want. So even when things are frustrating, we can still remain calm and continue forward so we get what we need. And this is something that definitely does not come to full development at this stage of life. If you can think about how many tantrums little kids throw, they're not the best at self-regulating their emotions. And to be honest, we don't really get very good at that until adulthood. So again, here's a list of all of our milestones that we have. Age 2 is usually when we start having kids playing with other people. Usually before that point, they get babies just kind of play with themselves. 6 months is a fun one because that's when babies start recognizing like themselves in a mirror. So they'll start seeing themselves and they have a lot of fun just looking at themselves in the mirror. Okay, so this I think is our last slide. So the other big thing that we need to talk about in infant social and emotional development is attachment. So attachment refers to the close bond that babies have with a caregiver that will give them a sense of security. Having a really good attachment is what serves as the foundation for future relationships. It can also help support the baby's confidence and their curiosity and just help them develop their sense of who they are. Its whole idea relates back to, if you remember again, one of the other theories we talked about in week 1 was Erickson's stages. So this one relates most to the stage of trust versus mistrust. Babies need their needs to be met by other people since they can't take care of themselves. So we, as babies, rely on other people to do what we need. So that stage of knowing that we can trust the caregiver to fulfill our needs and get us what we need to live is really important. A lack of a secure attachment can lead to something called reactive attachment disorder, which is when babies don't have that sense of security and trust in their caregiver, and it can lead to a lot of cognitive and social delays. And the ways that we kind of classify attachment style, it was this system was designed by a researcher named Mary Ainsworth, and her experiment, it's pretty famous in the world of psychology, is called the strange situation experiment. So it basically looked at how a baby responds when their caregiver decides to leave the room. So what would happen is you'd have a researcher and then a parent with the baby. For a little while, they'd play together, and then eventually the parent would leave the room, leaving the baby with the stranger. And the goal was to see how the baby would react, both when the parent leaves the room and then when the baby comes back. Or not when the baby comes back, when the parent comes back. So based on that, we split attachment into 4 different styles. So the first one is a secure style. So that would just mean the baby is happy when the parent is in the room. They feel kind of anxious and nervous, and they might be a little bit on edge when they leave the room. But then when they come back, it doesn't take long for them to calm down and understand that they're safe. Ambivalent or resistant is what we use when the baby just doesn't have a response at all. So they're kind of the same throughout the whole thing. When the mom or the parent leaves the room, nothing really happens. When they come back, nothing really happens. Avoidant is when the baby is very, very not social with other people. So even when the parent is in the room, they might not be responding to the researcher and doing what they want to do. So avoidant is just they're very shy and they're closed off and they're very on edge regardless of whether the parent is in the room or not. They're just in general just very stressed and anxious. And then distracted or disoriented is when the baby just has no clue what's happening in the world around them. So here, I think I have a list of all of these. That's a little bit better, so I can explain it to you guys. Okay, we are a little bit short on time, but this is the last slide, so we should be okay. All right, so the secure attachment style is that. The ambivalent style is when the baby is just very resistant to any change at all. They're just, did I mix these up? Sorry guys, I might have mixed these up. My mistake. So the ambivalent or resistant style is when the baby is super, super stressed and very distressed regardless of what's going on. They won't even get comforted when the parent comes back into the room. They're very, very clingy to the parent. They're very scared of anything new. And then avoidant is the one where they just don't have a reaction at all. So they just don't really care what's going on. They're just avoiding the situation entirely. They might just be hanging out and playing with the toys. They're not going to treat the stranger any differently than the parent. They're very neutral about the whole thing. Then distracted or disoriented, we can also call this a disorganized style. That's basically just an inconsistent thing. So they might have a mix of all 3 of those at different points in time. So maybe they're really, really sad at the separation, which would make sense for a secure style. But then when they come back, they're going to be avoidant and they don't do anything. And then they might freak out or something like that when they try and when they're with the parent. It's constantly changing between the styles. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's also very dependent on culture. So if you're growing up in a different culture, your attachment style might be a little bit different. Okay, we did it. You survived. This is probably the longest day of content so far. So here is our big recap of everything we covered today. So we talked about birth. We talked about a newborn's characteristics. We talked about the reflexes that a newborn has. We talked about the dangers that a baby can be exposed to. And then we talked about, throughout the stages of life, we talked about the motor milestones, both gross, the big ones, the big movements, and then the fine ones, which are the smallest, precise movements. We talked about sensory capabilities, a baby's vision, hearing, their smell and taste. And we looked at cognitive development, specifically at Piaget's sensory motor stage and how we split that up. We looked at some cognitive milestones. I just kind of skipped over that slide. We went into depth on language development and the steps that babies go through as they learn a language. And then we talked about social and emotional development. So things like temperament and personality, some of the milestones that we get to, and then attachment styles. So that was a lot.